Hello, and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation about books your therapists may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're doing things a little differently and talking about a book that isn't released yet. We're talking to marriage and family therapist Adam James Cohen about his upcoming book, Second Adolescence, The Messessary Path to Queer Adulthood, which is based on his podcast, Second Adolescence. And then we're also talking about Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan.
Adam's podcast, Second Adolescence, is all about the messy, exhilarating, awkward, and healing-filled queer adulthood that comes after growing up through first adolescence in an anti-queer world. Each episode features a queer person sharing about their experience growing up, discovering their identity, coming out, and living through their own second adolescence. Adam's book, which is part memoir, part framework for what second adolescence is for queer people and how they move through it.
And our second book, Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan, is a young adult novel inspired by true events that follows two 17-year-old boys who set to break the world record by kissing for 32 hours. This book weaves together a number of multi-generational intertwining storylines where characters are also discovering their own identity and coming out. It was a really great conversation, and we hope you enjoy and forgive us for going a little bit off format.
So today on the podcast, we have Adam James Cohen, who uses pronouns he, him. And we are so happy to have you today. Thank you for joining us.
Excited to be here.
I guess we'll just jump right in and ask, why did you get into therapy? What inspired you to become a therapist? And, what do you enjoy about it?
I could talk for hours on this question. And so I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. I feel like for so many people who have the opportunity to choose the career they go into, like it's so many factors lead you to eventually feeling like that's the one you want to pursue. Absolutely true for me. But like the simple story, I guess, would be that, growing up, I was a kid who was just very sensitive, very empathetic. I felt big for myself, felt big for other people. And that kind of led me to really just take on this role kind of as therapist to my friends in elementary school and middle school. I was this little therapist on the playground and school halls, which in hindsight, maybe not great that I was like someone who was giving advice, but I also think my younger self did a pretty good job at that. But it always felt really natural. And I think just having that natural temperament, plus being a kid and teen who in my own story, I was navigating my own pain, my own experience, being a closeted person, just trying to reckon with what that meant. I think both my natural temperament and that experience really led me as I got older to just really feel a pull to want to just help as many people as possible, not feel alone, feel more seen, feel more free to be who they are. And that eventually pointed me into the work of therapy as kind of the container for that work to occur. And yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
I can relate to the sensitive kid and helper of friends.
Yeah.
And who are the populations that you work with and where do you work?
Yeah, well, so I'm based in San Francisco, California. I practice, I have an office here and also over in Marin County, and also work with folks throughout California via telehealth. And yeah, it's a big portion of my work. Will kind of lead into a big topic that we talk about today is working with queer people. And I'm going to use the word queer today as like an umbrella term. It's synonymous how I use it with the acronym LGBTQ+. So really including all folks who would fit under that bracket, essentially non-cisgendered heterosexual people. So that's a big focus of my work with lots of adults navigating through that experience, particularly through this lens of second adolescence, which we'll go into. But also on the other end of that, I started out my career specializing in first adolescence. So working with middle schoolers, high schoolers into college. And that's like been a bread and butter sweet spot of my work. And I really love that work as well, not just with queer adolescents, but all adolescents. And so my practice is kind of split between those two populations with some smattering of a few individuals who are just curious to work with me for various other reasons that I also love the variety there. And yeah, I feel, I was just talking about this with someone about how I feel so honored to get to do the work I get to do. It's like such a humbling thing and a privilege to get to be in the role of being someone who someone trusts with their story and with their vulnerabilities and their pain. And
Mm.
I feel like I really am aware of like how big of a responsibility that is. And I just feel really humbled and grateful that I get to do it. And I'm just always in awe of the people I work with, like navigating whatever their challenge is and really trying to move through it with such yeah, vulnerability and strength. And it's just a really powerful, cool process. So I feel really pumped to get to do what I do.
Mm.
I think that's something I've taken away from having these conversations with different therapists is the
Mm.
passion that you guys really bring to it. So I like that you highlighted that piece because that seems to be a theme overall that people are really kind of just passionate about the work that you're doing. Instead of us having kind of like a what I've been calling like a quote unquote clinical book or mental health related book for the first topic, we're actually taking it a little bit differently as we're talking about your podcast and also a book that you've been writing. So let's start with your podcast, which is Second Adolescence. Can you tell us about the concept behind it and what really inspired you to start a podcast?
You know, it's really come out of a combination of both my own personal process and noticing year after year in my practice themes shared by queer clients navigating their own healing journeys, as well as just what I've noticed out in the world with other queer people and their own stories. The term second adolescence first came to me in a journaling exercise when I was 25. So back in 2013, you know, at that time, I was just a few months into dating men for the first time myself. I was feeling so chaotic. I felt like so inexperienced. I felt awkward. I felt like this like quintessential insecure teenager navigating dating for the first time. And so I wrote into my journal, I'm 25, but I feel 13. And then
Mm.
I said, I feel like I'm going through another adolescence, a second adolescence. And then, like in that moment after I wrote Second Adolescence, I really froze. My whole body tingled. I pulled back from the page and just saw this label that really felt so true for what I was navigating. And that then kind of became a framework I kind of started using to make sense of my experience. And then like later, as I stepped more deeply into clinical work, working with other queer people as the years went by, just really again saw themes popping up left and right here
Mm.
that were similar to my own and similar to other queer people I have encountered. And so I gradually started developing this concept of second adolescence. What I work with now is this sort of developmental life stage we queer people move through in our post coming out years in adulthood after growing up in this world that really didn't allow us full access to the same adolescence our cisgendered straight peers had access to, you know, like this adolescence where we could have crushes and share about them with our
Mm.
friends, this adolescence where we could explore the firsts of dating and relationships and go to prom with people of gender we truly desired. You know, the adolescence where we could be just seen and known by people in our life, and the adolescence where we didn't suffer from the chronic shame of being something the world around us was telling us was not okay. You know, so many queer people had a younger years and like developmental years, childhood, adolescence, just marked by missing out on a lot of experiences and also just accruing so many wounds for being who they were. And so second adolescence is really just about reckoning with that and gaining the missed experiences and healing the wounds of our younger selves. And so I was conceptualizing second adolescence and really talking a lot about this with folks in my practice and just wanted to find a way to like share more of this information and make it more widely accessible. I think that's the other tricky thing I've just navigating as a therapist, like the friction of, ooh, okay, I'm only a certain amount of certain people can have access to me as a therapist based off the
Mhm.
financial kind of barriers of therapy. And I wanted to figure out a way to just like make some of this work that I've been working on and talking about with people more accessible. So that's where the podcast came to mind. And I also wanted to find a way to like widen and deepen the tapestry of second adolescence with more diverse stories and experiences and
Mm.
hear from more people about what their own journey of queer healing has been. And so that's really what the podcast is all about, really focusing on the wide variety of queer experiences and healing in second adolescence and just trying to offer a space for people to just find more ways to feel less alone and have a little bit more language to make sense of what they are going through.
I think that podcasting is such a kind of personal way of reaching people for sure. And like, was there any hesitation on your part, especially with your guests? You know, you're asking them to be quite kind of vulnerable and share a lot. But I mean, you navigate it so well in your interviews. You do a great job. But um, like, have you learned a lot since you've began? It's been a couple of years now, or have you changed tactics or anything?
I think, I too was feeling a little apprehensive around just really wanting to be sensitive to like it's a real offering for people to share their own story and to be vulnerable and to invite strangers into listening. And I think I express that sensitivity with conversations ahead of time before recording with guests, just to really make sure we're on the same page. They feel comfortable, really empowering them to know they can exclude or include whatever they're wanting. And also on the back end, after we record, they have the opportunity to edit out whatever they're wanting. I want them to own their story. But what I've really found and been most surprised by, I guess maybe not surprised, but maybe pleasantly just experiencing how most people want to be seen and known and like want their story to be told. And
Hmm.
particularly for so many queer people, there's been various obstacles to them feeling like they've been able to take up space and let their story be seen and known. And so it's been just like a really, I mean, I talked about feeling humbled as a therapist. Like in my role, I feel very humbled in my role as a podcast host, being a place to hold and witness and celebrate the stories of these various people who in many ways didn't feel able to share their story up until now. And so it's again a responsibility to not take lightly, and has just been really affirming to see that people at our core, we want to be seen and known, and to be told like, hey, yeah, I see you, your story matters. And within the queer community in particular, so much like of our own individual healing comes from this collective healing. And like there's this like back and forth process of being witness to other people's story as a way to help our own. And by sharing ours, we're helping other people. It's like this really beautiful web of queer healing that happens. And I think the people who come on, they tend to say something around that note of, I want to contribute to this collective work that's been helping me. And if my story can reach someone and make them feel less alone, that completely matters. Uh, so yeah, it's it's just so special. I smile whenever I think about it. I feel really, really grateful to get to do it.
The way that the podcast unfolds is just so magic in every story. I feel you kind of go in maybe expecting a certain story, and I think the vulnerability really takes it to another level. And there's also a piece around everyone has a different experience in second adolescence, just like we all have, different teen years. I think it's such an opportunity to really get to know someone in a way that is so connecting. I'm reading this book right now called the Art of Gathering, and it
Mm,
talks about how the podcast The Moth, how that kind of came from, the creator of The Moth was going to these poetry readings and just felt like there was something really lacking in terms of just the vulnerable piece, and found that sort of the preamble before someone was reading their poem was the part that felt the most connecting. And
mm,
there's something about kind of speaking off the cuff, something about sharing your own story in a way that's not written out, that people really connect to. And I feel like your podcast does such a good job of that, of sort of digging into people's stories in a really respectful way and allowing them to unfold in like a safe space.
mm. Thank you.
And that must be kind of inspiring to keep going. And then also inspiring in the fact that you're writing a book too, Second Adolescence, The Messessary Path to Queer Adulthood. So can you tell us about this? Like, have you written before? Like, what's the process been like for this?
Yes. So yes, I joke with people when I talk about this as like I've written a book and I don't identify as a writer. And I think that's slowly changing. I like never it was never a real intention of mine to be here, but I'll back up and kind of story tell in that around the time, when was it? I guess back in 2019, I started this personal writing project. I mentioned earlier how I kind of was moving through a lot of like the years since 2013 with this framework of second adolescence, trying to like make sense of it. Then in my clinical work, really kind of finding more and more uh, connection with it and other people's stories. So I felt this pull in 2019 just to start writing about my own story through this lens, just to try to better understand like what is second adolescence? How did that show up in my own experience? Like what was my own journey? And so it started as essentially what became like a memoir of my own story through this lens of second adolescence. And I then kind of I mean, writing it was just so wild and something I tell people whenever I talk about it, like just try to write your own personal story. Like I think it's so personally healing without even doing anything with it. Like the process of doing that first draft, which, I hear a lot of writers call the first draft the vomit draft, where you're just like putting words on the page. Like the process of writing that vomit draft was just so powerful and cathartic and fun and healing. And I think like anybody who's curious to write and spend time reflecting on their story should absolutely do it, even if it's not something you're wanting to share with anybody. But so I, had my vomit draft, and then I was like, oh, maybe this is a memoir, maybe this could be a book. And so I started kind of constructing it as a book. But then after some conversations with some literary agents, and at this time I'd already started Second Adolescence and really been putting a lot of energy there. Feedback I got from them was, hey, you know what? Like, I think what's missing is more of the voice that you're using on the podcast in the way you're writing and sharing information on Instagram, and really was encouraging me to really think about a book as a tool for like a more prescriptive tool for queer people. I think memoirs are healing and are tools for healing just to be witnessed to in general. But I got feedback and encouragement to explore what could this look like, putting more of my therapist hat on. And so I spent, another couple of years diving into that process of exploring how to make this book from that lens. And that's kind of where we're at now. And feel grateful to be working with Susan Schulman, who's literary agent, and she's out there. As of today, we're trying to find the right home for it. And yeah, I just feel really pumped, but it's been a journey to say the least.
Yeah, I'm excited for whenever this hits the world. I read a lot of memoirs, like a lot of different like people from all sorts of backgrounds and things. And I'm surprised to hear you say you kind of like got so much enjoyment out of that first draft, because I feel like memoir writing seems so scary or difficult, or maybe that's just your work as a therapist that you're more attuned, or like your empathetic self, to like being aware of like those harder periods. But so you didn't find it as difficult to dive into the tougher stories of your life?
That's a good question. I think, and maybe I am an anomaly, because I just loved it. And I think the reason why I actually loved it, and maybe I think part of this is also my own personal process, my own personal healing, and also how I work with people. I do a lot of work with younger selves in the way I work with my queer clients in our healing, really from this belief that we all hold the wounds of our younger selves. And the task of the adult is finding ways to offer tending and healing to those wounds that are still there. And particularly with queer people, I find there's such power in finding like active, consistent relationship to our younger selves. And I think for me in my own process, I think that's why I loved the vomit draft of spending so much time in my own personal process, is because I, in my own personal therapy and my own personal healing work, like developed quite quick and easy access to these different younger selves, 3-year-old me, 7-year-old me, 12-year-old me, high school me, 18-year-old me. And so it felt actually quite cool and powerful to more intentionally like give space for them to be on the page and to be seen and heard and witnessed, and in turn kind of let me even more deeply as my adult self kind of being with their experiences, kind of better understand what they went through. They, as in what I went through, but I do like to kind of talk about these younger selves as their own individual entities. And I invite clients to do the same thing. There's something that can be really powerful. A little bit more psychological space gets created when we kind of externalize them as their own entity. And so, yeah, so I think because I already was holding this kind of tender relationship with these younger parts of me, and also maybe like felt like they had more that they wanted to say. And so they were kind of pumped to like be with me in the morning with my coffee while like they were telling me all about what it was like in high school. It made the whole process actually quite beautiful. And the only real difficult part throughout all of this has just been editing and constructing a book, taking, the 150,000 words of the vomit draft down to like a digestible 70,000. So that's, yeah, the editing. That's a whole other conversation of what it means to kind of construct a book. But yeah, on the personal lens, it was actually quite beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, like the editing piece will probably like be forever. Then after the piece, but how did you? Sorry, my last question about the writing of it, and then we can
No,
move
yeah,
on. But
please. Cool.
how did you start? Did you like? Was it chronological? Was it like more like what was the time period that maybe sticks out the most, or like had the most impact, or how did you navigate your past?
Yeah, and this was just my own experience and process with writing it. I like kind of had this really juicy practice when I was first in the vomit draft phase of just like each morning, like with my coffee, sitting in my bed with my computer and just like close my eyes and just ask like, okay, which part of my story wants to come up in this moment? Which like sounds so woo woo. By the way, I am so woo woo. So just get used to it. And I love it. But it was also just like a cool practice for me because I think if I would have, for my brain, it wouldn't like having to start at the beginning and work my way. I wanted to like ease my way into the work because again, I didn't identify as a writer. I never set a goal for writing a book initially. But I just like was feeling pulled to put words on the page, and that was the way I did it. And then eventually there came moments where like, okay, I got to figure out. I never talked about this period. Okay, I got to dive
Mm,
into there. Okay, I got to talk about this period. So then there was a little bit more uh, intentionality and less of that woo woo energy that drove me. But that was, yeah, just the initial phases. And then, yeah, it got a little bit more cerebral or heady once I got more into the, editing phase. And particularly when I was then taking it up from a memoir to a little bit more of a prescriptive book. That was a different process, but I had most of the groundwork there.
just so we're clear, woo woo is always welcome here. And in fact,
Mhm.
encouraged. So I appreciate you sort of naming that piece because I think there's so many ways to work with your inner child. And I feel like this is the perfect plug for, I feel like as a therapist and, in my own work, I'm always encouraging clients to journal and write. And it's like, this is the perfect advertisement for that, right? Like here is this personal practice that was a healing tool that is now being turned into this, beautiful art. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that piece and how important it is to find different ways to connect to your inner child at all the different ages, right? So yeah, you're really practicing what we preach, right?
Cool. It's fun. It's
Yeah.
fun. Mhm. Mhm.
One phrase that Tara and I both talked about that we loved was "messessary."
Mm.
Can you chat a little bit about this and what you mean by it?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, for so many queer people in their adolescence, or their second adolescence, and particularly in those beginning years of second adolescence when they're first exploring, yeah, who they are at their most free and true, what it means to be dating as their authentic self, it can be a pretty fumbling and messy experience. Like, we are adults. Many of us are coming out and exploring dating as adults, trying to do things that, our peers were starting to explore in middle school and high school. We don't have a lot of experience as we're learning how to message someone on a dating app, go on a first date, have a first sexual encounter, how to be in a
Mm,
relationship, how to have a breakup. Like all these things are often new experiences that activate and force growth on parts of our experiences that because we grew up either in the closet or otherwise unable to live fully as ourselves in adolescence, these parts of ourselves are kind of stunted or didn't have a lot of room to develop until later. And so that's why kind of like I said earlier in my own process, I felt like a teenager as I was 25 navigating dating
mm,
for the first time, and why so many other people feel the same way. Like these parts of ourselves are needing to grow and have experiences that allow us to grow. And so necessaries are really these necessarily messy experiences that
mm,
promote the growth of ourselves, promote the growth of our romantic selves, sexual selves, relational selves. And
mm,
necessary became a phrase that I developed in my practice when talking with queer clients to both like bring some humor to like how messy and how ridiculous it can be in those early years of queer dating, but also to really both normalize what they're going through as something that is really shared and other people are having the same experience, but also to invite a lens of recognizing there's something really powerful happening here in these fumbling experiences, in the messy. Like there's so much growth that happens for queer people. And so really inviting a little bit more of that self-compassionate lens to approach what, like how chaotic it can feel. And so that's, yeah, what the Messessaries are. And I really feel like they really encapsulate so much of what second adolescence is and is, yeah, just a tender thing.
Mm.
I was wondering if it had anything or kind of related to as well how a lot of the queer spaces are like bars or like after hours as well. Like I know it's kind of changing now, but a lot of it is revolved
Mm.
around like nightlife.
Mm.
I was wondering if that was kind of part of the necessary piece as well.
I mean, I'm sure there's definitely folks who, uh, when they think about their experience as being messy, as being influenced or taking place in those spaces, I think
Mm.
particularly for, I mean, the gay bar has like a long history in the queer experience and a long, powerful, beautiful, important history. And I mean, the tangent conversation I want to have is around like substance use within the queer community. We could talk about that later,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, oftentimes like gay bars and queer bars are spaces that the newly out adults trying to find themselves goes to when they are trying to find community, when they're trying to find a place to like feel free. And to some extent, maybe culture and story like really amplifies that as like the only place to go, which I think is problematic. And I think there's lots of other beautiful places that people can find community and find liberation and freedom. And there is still a lot of beauty and power that happens in the queer bar and the gay bar. And it can also be the place where, we're throwing these adults who are in this process of trying to heal and grow
Mm.
and trying to date for the first time into a place where there's, substances, alcohol. It's gonna often be a recipe for a little bit of a messy situation, and at times, can lead to, I talk with people through Messessaries that there's also this real need to also hold accountability for if and when like they lead to situations that cause harm to someone else, cause harm to us or to someone else, and so there's a real need to also bring some responsibility to it too.
Mm.
But I think Messessary is not limited to just like those experiences where we picture someone navigating an encounter at a bar or afterwards, but really like you can have a Messessary like at 8 a.m. in the morning when you're trying to figure out like, oh, I sent this text. Oh, it was wrong. Oh gosh. Oh, I don't
Mm.
know. Or like it can encapsulate so many other parts of the person's experience, um, too. Yeah.
Yeah, my therapist brain went a little bit to this idea of parts of ourselves disintegrating, or we're sort of we're stepping back to look at this part that maybe served us when we were, in the closet, and then we come out and we have these other parts that get to emerge, and so we're disintegrating these other parts and reintegrating the parts that feel true to us, right? So yeah, my brain went in sort of a different direction, and that's what I
Cool.
think is so beautiful about the term, is that I
Mm.
feel like it can encompass a whole range of experiences and be applied to a bunch of different contexts.
Totally, totally. And I feel like that's true with so many of the things that I talk about in second adolescence, even second adolescence as a whole, it all becomes like something for someone else to like use as a way to make sense of their own experience. And that's going to be different for everybody. Different things are going to get activated and different things are going to come up to the table to make sense of what does it mean for me to have a necessary? What does second adolescence mean for me? And so I think, yeah, there's
Mm.
something cool just about, and that's how I've also been really hopefully clear when I talk about it with people. It's like there's not just one way to do
Mm.
queer healing, not one way to do second adolescence. It's going to look so different for each of us, and because everyone's going to have their own unique spin on it. Hmm.
And a work in progress, I'd imagine as well.
Mm.
Hell
Mhm.
yeah. Yep.
Mhm.
Big time. Big time.
Mhm.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you've done a really good job of sort of weaving in your own experience as a therapist and alongside the process of writing the book and the podcast. But I'm curious if there's been anything from the podcast that sort of influenced your work as a therapist.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, and they both, everything's been interconnected and
Mm-hmm.
woven. I think through the podcast and through the Instagram community and different writing that I'm doing there and way I'm talking about it and also stories and way I'm hearing other people talk about it. it's kind of adding together to this greater kind of group collective mind on like, what does healing mean for me and what can healing mean for someone else, and like the whole wide range and diversity of what healing means. And so I think absolutely from my work on the podcast, I found not only like more language for the experience just from like talking with people and thinking about writing about it and sharing with people that I've then brought into my practice and talked with clients about, but then also vice versa, the way I show up with clients or they show with me, like that, it all informs each other. I bring that then to the podcast. It's just been a really cool symbiotic relationship. And I think it's also just representative again of like, particularly for the queer community, the healing power of community and how like it's a collective experience that we're all kind of gradually supporting each other and everyone's own unique experience supports the other. And yeah. So I think it shows up with so much of this interconnectedness between these different roles that I hold of therapist and podcast host and writer. They all are, blending together a bit, which is pretty sweet.
See, you put writer in there, so you are a writer.
Oh, that's funny. That's okay. We'll have to spend
There we
another
go.
couple hours processing the resistance to that. Okay, I really appreciate that. I'm gonna
It's
claim
out
it.
there.
I'm
It's out
claiming
there.
it.
Yeah. Oh, and it's, what you're speaking to is, I think, important for listeners to know too. You do impact your own personal therapist. Like, you are influencing your therapist every day in a way that I don't know if a lot of clients understand that. Like, we are really impacted. I can only speak for myself, but I'm so impacted by my clients and I learn so much from them and they influence my life in so many different ways. And you sort of named that. It's all woven into this tapestry that makes you you and all these different parts of you. But it's, I think, important for people to know that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not robots. We are humans in the room with you or on Zoom with you, wherever we are. And even though we hold a certain role, like we are first and foremost feeling people. Like we feel deeply, we feel you, and we want to be there with you. And just as much as we try to help folks, like there's always this inadvertent, like they help us or they inspire or deepen and enrich us as well. It's a really beautiful, interconnected process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Who do you think would get the most out of the podcast or your book coming out, or who's your dream audience?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like most of the folks in our little second adolescence community are people who just identify as like having grown up in a world that made them feel like they didn't belong and are in this really complicated process as adults, trying to find who am I at my most true and free? What does liberation mean for me? What does queer healing mean for me? So yeah, I think most of the folks who I think this work benefits and are contributing to the work are queer people over 18, all the way up people up in their 90s who are participating. And it's really beautiful. But also it's been really special to hear from allies who are listeners of the show and parents of queer adults who recently came out that they're trying to figure out how do I support my kid. I've gotten a couple messages from teenagers whose parents have come out. They're like, what does this mean for my parent? And oh, maybe this is what they've experienced. So it's just been really cool to see kind of the spread of folks who are finding real resonance with this and are really pumped to keep learning more. And so yeah, those are who tend to want to come to this little corner of the internet. And I think the book is written for it. When I was writing the book, I was just I just like created this, like, whenever I hit a writing block moment, I just created an image of all the different people I've talked with on the podcast, and this image of other queer people I've like seen in my life, and just kind of little archetypes, characters of them. And just, I started writing towards them, like, and their younger selves, like, what would I want them to know? And so there is, again, I'm writing it, but it's really connected and fueled by everyone else. Totally.
It's cool that you mentioned that, because when we shift gears, there's a part of the book that we're going to talk about where there's this interconnectedness. So, all right, let's do it.
I just wanted to say congrats on writing a book, because that is no mean feat and you did it. So just putting that out there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm proud of myself too. Thank you.
You're a writer.
LOL. Okay.
Okay, so we are going to move on to the second part, which is looking at the book that was chosen for this week or for this month. And we did something a little bit different. Typically, we're sort of focusing on, a mental health related book and then just any other sort of book of the therapist or mental health practitioner choosing. And, when we got together, we kind of talked about like what feels good for this episode. And you sort of mentioned maybe highlighting some, queer authors that have written, YA queer fiction. So we decided or you chose the book Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan. Why did you choose this book?
I wanted to highlight queer young adult fiction because, over the years, so many people in my practice, so many people in my personal life, me, like, have talked about being so drawn to and affected by queer young adult fiction, books, movies, TV shows, being so, like, getting so activated by, and so much gets evoked in us when we witness these stories, more so almost than stories of queer people our own age. And oftentimes there can also be a little bit of embarrassment. I hear from folks about, I'm an adult, but who wants to read this book about a 14-year-old? Is that okay? But like, I talk so often with people about, no, there's something really powerful in our own process as queer adults trying to heal and find liberation in engaging with queer YA, because it's a medium that offers so much for us. I mean, first and foremost, these were stories that our younger selves didn't have access to. Like, we did not have access to stories where we saw ourselves represented. Like, a little 14-year-old us didn't see a 14-year-old person with our same kind of identity markers trying to navigate a first crush. Like, these stories didn't really exist for many of us when we were younger. And also, like, many of us weren't living out these stories in our own personal lives. And so by engaging with queer young adult fiction, there can be this almost like vicarious experiencing that our younger selves can have by being witness to these queer characters' stories. And it's something that's really powerful and beautiful there. And something I also find with queer people exploring and engaging with queer young adult work is something that is more painful, but I think actually really important. It can often invoke feelings of grief about our own experience by really seeing again these younger queer people having experiences that we wished our younger selves could have, like, so envy for that, or deep longing and sorrow that we didn't get to have that. And so I think queer YA can also be another tool through which to be with our grief and move through it. And oftentimes I wouldn't say I prescribe queer YA to clients, but I definitely invite and encourage people to engage with that type of work. And in the same process, like, invite and bring in their younger selves in the process to allow them to be present and to see what comes up as they witness, yeah, what's it like for me to read this book about these two boys kissing, or watch Heartstopper, or all these other queer YA stories out there that we now have access to. We didn't then. There can be a real beautiful and a real opportunity for healing for our younger selves through this process. And so all that to say is why I wanted to talk about a queer YA book. And I chose Two Boys Kissing for a number of reasons. I mean, the one, a limitation is that it really just centers on the gay male experience. This isn't necessarily a book highlighting a ton of, queer female or non-binary diversity. But I've been recommended this book by actually so many clients over the years that, and then I myself have found so much personal value that I wanted to spend time talking about it. And, it centers on, really follows these 18 gay kids, particularly with these two boys who are trying to break the world record for the longest kiss. And like any, like other queer young adult stories, it features, yeah, the thrilling feelings of romance and love and sex and relationships and the challenges of that, as well as like, highlighting the harmful damage that can come from a culture of anti-queerness and the impacts that can have on young people's mental and physical health. But what I love about this book is how the narrator is this voice of queer ancestors, this collective us and we who are guiding us through the story, primarily gay men who died of AIDS. And it's for this reason that I think this book is so powerful, because it does a lot of different things. I mean, at one, I think it's a real powerful, through hearing kind of this narrator's voice of these queer ancestors kind of talking about what it's like for them to observe and be witness to and be in relationship with these younger queer people now, and both reflect their own feelings about their own grief and their own longing and their own experiences of also joy and power of what it was like for them in their lives, but also what it's like for them to see this happening for these young people, and like this connectedness between them. It really offers like a really beautiful model too for the queer adult reader of this book, for how we ourselves can also be in relationship with people, queer people of other generations, both the young people in this book, but also like it can't help but activate your own feelings about and relationship to our queer ancestors and queer elders. And so I think I really was so moved by and think it's so powerful that this book kind of follows the narrator, has the narrator voice of these queer elders, because it also just like mirrors a process I see that's been so helpful for so many people in their queer healing, of like just continuing to find a way, what does it mean to be in relationship to all the generations of queer people within this greater community, and allowing for any feelings we have for those who came before us, those after us. Like it's just, I could gush for hours on it. I think there's just something so powerful here, and yeah, it's a book I come back to like once a year just to kind of dive into, because it's just a beautiful, yeah, it's just a beautiful, beautiful book.
It's so beautiful. And reading it, I had the full spectrum of experience: joy, happiness, fear, grief. I cried during this book. I was, really touched by some of the scenarios where, the boys had a supportive family, right? Like it's very layered, in a way that was a little bit unexpected for me, which I think makes it just so, so good. Right. And you're speaking to, it just has a pretty interesting narrative. And, I also think that the author does a really good job weaving the narratives together, showing like both really good experience and challenging experiences for people that are coming out. And do you see any sort of like second adolescence happening in the book?
Good question. I think, for many stories in queer YA fiction, what's powerful is we're often getting to witness young people hopefully having to have less of a second adolescence, because they're getting to have more and more experiences in their first adolescence, and are able to do so without as much shame as many adults these days experience in our own second adolescence. So actually in this book, I actually found a lot of second adolescence, not in the teens and their experiences, but really in like the narrator's voice, in like hearing from this collective queer elder ancestor voice about their own process and their own experience, and what it was like for them growing up in a world that didn't feel like they could belong within, growing up with so much oppression, growing up with so much anti-queerness, and then finding each other, the power of community, the celebration, the healing that happens in that process. And then, the grief of, yeah, I mean, not only the grief of navigating this trauma and horror of the AIDS epidemic, but in this story, like the grief that comes from witnessing these younger people getting to have it easier than we did, these younger people getting to have experiences that we did not get to have. That is so second adolescence. And so, yeah, I was really touched and moved, particularly by, again, the narrator's voice throughout it all, because I think it just was such a powerful invitation and modeling for the reader, particularly the queer adult reader, to see, oh, here's a way I too can find a balance between honoring like the pain of my own experience while also holding space for acknowledging the pain of other people and the joy of other people. And yeah, it was just really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this book coming out and maybe queer folks in the past not having access to this type of story, right? And interestingly enough, it's also on a lot of banned book lists, right? And for listeners that aren't familiar with the book, the cover actually has two boys kissing on it. So, we could assume that that might play into why it's banned. Do you think that this actually makes people more eager to read it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for many people who hold identities marginalized by the powers that be in our culture, whenever we hear a book is put on a banned list, this for sure signals to us that there's a high likelihood that this book may contain stories of people who we will resonate with and people who have similar experiences to us or people who we have compassion and empathy for understanding what it feels like to be the other. I think, yeah, whenever these books get placed on this banned list, it kind of just amplifies our desire to want to read and
Mm-hmm.
support them because we can feel we all know what it feels like to have culture tell us we should hide, and the culture is trying to make these stories hide. And so I think it makes a lot of us more pumped to want to buy them books and read
Mm-hmm.
them and share them with people who we think they can help feel more free and less alone.
Seems so funny that a book can be such a scary thing to some
Mm-hmm.
people. Like it is
Mm-hmm.
wild, but it just shows the powerful writing in this book. And you talked a little bit about YA at this kind of at the start of this piece.
Yeah.
Like, and YA as a genre is so interesting because, like, it's evolved a lot in, like, I mean, it's been around for a while, but like, especially in the past, like, 10 years, it has definitely evolved. And people thinking that it's just for children, or like for teens or young adults. And it really isn't. Like, there's adults that like only read YA. Like Amanda, you were saying, like, I found this book also very moving.
Mm-hmm.
It made me cry. And I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe that's to do with my personality. The heavy bits really stayed with me. And I found it hard to
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
like focus on the lighter bits because it's very funny as well. Like
Mm.
so it's a really sort of thorough read. And I guess maybe I don't have a question from that, but just kind of it's interesting how YA lends itself to that as a genre. And yeah, do you think that that's what kind of makes this book so effective?
Yeah. And I think like you're also, I mean, I think you also are both just very like empathetic, kind, loving people. And so I think I'm glad to hear how affected you were by this book. And I think like now I'm just thinking about why we adults are also so moved and affected by YA stories. I think in many ways, not just queer people within the lens of second adolescence, but many ways we all can feel our younger selves. We all remember what it felt like at different points. And so there's something really like moving still about being witness to younger people's stories because like whether we were dealing with being closeted and feeling like we weren't okay as a closeted gay person or whatever our experience was in adolescence, like oftentimes it's such a charged time for humans in general. And so in many ways we kind of all still have a little bit of an adolescent self still there. And so it doesn't surprise me to see even beyond just like the queer population that YA is such a booming industry and or booming like part of the literary world and media because like yeah, again, we all kind of have those younger selves there and there's a resonance that we all feel when being witness to younger stories that either are like the ones we got to live or are unlike the ones we got to live or the ones we wish we got to live. And again, I think for queer people in particular, it can just be so powerful and beneficial to let ourselves be witness to and also be affected by what it's like to witness these young stories and um, again use it as a tool for our own healing and liberation now.
I listened to the audiobook of this and was surprised that the author narrates it, which is not normal. It's not common for like fiction or YA. Like usually the you would hire a narrator and but he did a really great job narrating his own book. So I thought that was sort of interesting. And I was wondering if you had even considered like being the podcaster if your book goes to the audiobook realm, like, how
Mm-hmm.
would that feel like narrating that piece?
Wow, I've never been asked that question. I'm sure very, very special. I didn't know that David read this book as the narrator in the audio version. I'd be really curious to hear it from his voice, knowing it was from his mind. I think there's something really special there.
It really added to it. I was surprised and then kind of like really even
Yeah.
more intrigued to jump in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, if I have the opportunity to, I think absolutely I would love to. That would be a real gift. I know in the publishing world, there's some things that are a little bit out of your control with maybe some of these decisions, but I would selfishly, I can imagine that could be like another layer of help and healing for even me in my own personal process, like writing all the different iterations, the like tens and 20 versions of drafts of this book. Each time I went through it, it was like another layer of something else locked in for me, or another layer of healing happened. And so I think, again, for anybody who's curious to reflect on any type of personal project of reflecting on their experience, telling their story, like each time we visit our story, something new can happen, something powerful can happen. And so, yeah, I would love to narrate the book. That'd be quite exciting.
You have such a great voice for it too. Your voice is just such a comfort. And my mind was kind of wandering to like having your clients hear you read the book. Like, that would just be so amazing.
That's really sweet. What just popped up for me was like little 12-year-old Adam, who did not like the way his voice sounded on the family's answering machine. And so little 12-year-old me is like, hell yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Let's take that
hell
compliment.
yeah.
That's great. That's really sweet.
For the youths, we used to have answering machines because phones didn't always reach everyone all the time. Just
right.
I mean, not that there's
a disclaimer there.
The disclaimer.
Oh, yeah, that's so
we are old.
That is so funny. Yep.
But let's go back to Two Boys Kissing for a second. And who do you think the audience of this book is? Because it definitely isn't just the young adult, but who do you think it is, and what do you think the reader gets the most out of reading a book like this?
First and foremost, I definitely think of any queer person. Again, it focuses primarily on the gay male experience, the gay cis and trans male experience. And so if you're someone holding a different identity and you're wanting to see your story more reflected, this wouldn't be that book. There's tons of great queer YA out there to go find. But I think this book is just really helpful for any queer person who is curious to just find more ways, again, to be in relationship to all the generations of queer people that came before and after us, and it's also like, it's a fun concept, this idea of two boys kissing to win a world record, but like there's a lot of depth and power in this book and other storylines, even in that one as well. Again, it's a beautiful interweaving of stories. But I also think, like, again, I appreciate you both sharing how affected you were. I think that there's a wide audience to this book of just anyone wanting to just hold space for and be with a story rooted in finding community, in healing, in finding joy. And for anybody who's ever felt like they didn't belong, I feel like this is a great book to be witness and be a part of this world where these different people are finding what that means for them.
And now the most important question. Could you kiss anyone for 32 hours?
I know, right? So while I was reading, all I could think about was like, my back is gonna hurt, my lips are gonna, like, that just feels impossible.
Imagine I were both like, we were like, that's gross. We don't want to do that.
Yes,
I don't think I could do it.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it would have to, I don't see how I could ever possibly do that. I was very impressed. Some of that could be like being in a 36-year-old body versus a 15-year-old body. I don't know. But yeah, it sounds ridiculous and very hard.
Yeah, it would have to be somebody pretty special.
Totally. Maybe if I wouldn't mind lying down. Like, they're standing up in the book. If I could lie down, maybe like on the side, perhaps. I don't know. Oh, goodness.
My body would just break down. I can't picture it, because they had to stand the whole time, right? And I would want to brush my teeth. Like, there's just a lot.
Totally.
But I appreciate the feat.
Totally. Totally.
I also like that it wasn't really like I know it was the world record, but it's not like they were winning like $1 million or anything. Like I loved
Right.
the how committed they were for
Yeah.
just the title. Like
Totally.
Hmm.
Which is also so adolescent-y. I love it. Yep.
Hmm.
absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on and chatting and sharing, about your experience and, and sharing a book today that also we both really, really enjoyed. Can you tell our listeners where to find you online?
Yeah. So if you're curious to know more and kind of follow more about Second Adolescence and learn more about the podcast and kind of learn more about the different things we're sharing on Instagram, first place on Instagram, you can find us at Second Adolescence Pod, or go to secondadolescencepod.com for all things about the podcast and Second Adolescence. And then if anyone's curious to know more about my clinical work, it's a different website. It's just adamcohenmft.com, and I'm right there.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. And if you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations, or maybe you're a mental health practitioner who's interested in coming on, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Happy connecting to your Messessary parts.
I was going to say the messy bit. That was exactly what I wrote. I was like, happy embracing and learning from the mess.
There you go.
Wow, that really stuck with us.